All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the penultimate morning of the conference. Hopefully you all agree it's been such a brilliant week. First up, please do come and sit at the tables. So we're getting all set up for tonight's banquet, but you are welcome to come and sit at the tables now and throughout the day. So please go ahead. So my name is Alice Rogers. I'm one of the, I think it was 74 New Zealand delegates here from Victoria University of Wellington. And it's a real pleasure for me to be able to chair this morning's plenary session. So before I introduce our plenary speaker for the morning, I'd first like to welcome the Deputy Director of the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, Jabba Batista, who's going to give a short address as our sponsor.
Thank you, Alice. Kia ora morena. Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you today. I think I truly here stand as a fellow colleague from the Caribbean islands coming all the way to the Pacific to share knowledge and insights on coral reef science, but beyond in this great symposium. So a big shout out there to some of the faces I've seen and accents I've heard from Jamaica, from the Dutch Antilles, from the US Virgin Islands, from Puerto Rico, from the Dominican Republic, and many other Caribbean island fellows that I know are here today. The Global Fund for Coral Reefs is really proud to be a partner of this amazing symposium that has brought 2,100 people together from the 93 countries and the 74 New Zealanders. In fact, for those 74 New Zealanders, do feel very proud that as the only global financial mechanism dedicated to coral reefs, New Zealand is one of our great partners. The GFCR focuses on safeguarding the most resilient reefs around the world, the communities that they underpin, and that are also the stewards of this ecosystem, and the economies that they also sustain. And for our work to be relevant and to be impactful, science is essential. Good investments cannot be made without good science, and that is what all of you are doing. And for me, that is the most important message that I can bring to you. Keep doing this very important work, because the work that you are doing is not only influencing policy, it's influencing where finance should go. And at the same time, as we put forward our finance out there in projects, we are also looking at how we can contribute to further science for coral reefs. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jabba. So today's plenary speaker is Professor Christina Hicks. And Christina is a globally recognized interdisciplinary social scientist and marine conservationist. Christina has an amazing body of work covering topics such as fisheries governance, food justice and nutrition, and the politics and finance and investment in fisheries and food systems. Christina is a Pew Fellow. She's won many prestigious awards. And I know Christina as a kind of a highly supportive and inspirational leader and mentor, an all-round wonderful human. So please join me in welcoming Professor Christina Hicks.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I want to begin by acknowledging the mana whenua of this land, Te Make Makaru, and pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Simon, Davey, Stacey Jupiter, Murray Ford. Thank you for the sponsors. Thank you, Georgina Watson, and thank you for everyone sat around that room who decided or agreed to invite me here today. The organisation of the conference has been fantastic. The venue is amazing. The sessions and talks have been really inspirational. I haven't been to an ICRS conference since Cairns, which is a long time ago, and this is definitely reminding me what a wonderful community this is. It is an immense privilege to be stood here speaking to this audience. Coral reef science opened up a world to me that I did not know existed. 20-odd years ago, in a small office off a beach in Kenya, Tim McClanahan took a chance and offered a single mother with very little experience a job as a fisheries scientist. And I had no idea then who he was, but that decision, that chance he took, really changed my life. So to anyone who's ever thought they don't belong in rooms like this or on beautiful stages like this, I hear you, and you do belong. And along the way, there have been many people, some of them here, who have believed in me when I didn't believe it myself, who have championed me when I needed it and constantly supported me. So with the power to open up doors, whether we say it or not, we never forget those opportunities. And though the little boy who stood by me all those years ago in Kenya is charting his own life, his two younger brothers, Finn and Sam, and their dad, Nick, are here today, and I want to thank you for your constant support. Now I'll get on with my talk. So I took this photograph a month ago on that beach in Kenya where I started out 20 years ago. And it's a small landing site, like many landing sites around the world. And since that time in Kenya, where all of my knowledge comes from, the underlying foundational knowledge that I have and I have gained around coral reefs, around fisheries, have come from my time traveling up and down the Kenyan coastline. But since then, I've traveled to many places around the world. I've been exceptionally fortunate. And the one thing that stood out to me is the immense diversity that exists across every coastline and community that I've visited. Diversity that lies below the water in the fish, invertebrates, and corals. Diversity in how people fish and what they catch. Diversity in what people eat and what they pair it with. And diversity in the range of jobs and occupations that are available to people. But when we study diverse and complex systems, we tend to separate them. So we separate the social from the ecological sciences. We separate fisheries from ecology. We separate social practices from dietary practices. And whilst this separation is useful to help us understand the mechanisms and the complexity and simplify the complexities of these systems to understand it, if we fail to reintegrate that knowledge, then we risk homogenizing and marginalizing these systems and undermining our ability to manage for that diversity. So what I'd like to do today is take a look at that diversity and its implications across multiple domains. To look at the diversity that lies below our waters and what that means. The diversity that exists in how and what we fish. The diversity in what we eat, in the jobs we do, and how we come together to govern these complex systems. And I want to look also at how that diversity connects back and reinforces and is integrated across these different components of the system. So I don't think I need to talk to this audience about how important biodiversity is. The immense biodiversity and the value of that biodiversity and the ecosystem processes and functions that it supports. But from a socio-ecological perspective, that biodiversity comes to bear in various ways, particularly when we take a step back and look at how that diversity across coral reefs relates to the broader ocean diversity. So this map that you can see on the screen illustrates a phenomenon you'll all be familiar with, how the greatest levels of biodiversity tend to be concentrated across the tropics and concentrated in the coastal areas. So those coastal regions, the mangroves, the seagrass beds, and the coral reefs that we all study. These areas of the tropics are also where we tend to find the highest levels of linguistic diversity. And linguistic diversity can be thought of as a proxy of cultural diversity. So this co-occurrence of linguistic diversity and biodiversity isn't causal, and there are many explanations or theories surrounding why we have this coincidence of high areas of biodiversity with high areas of linguistic diversity. But it's likely that many of the processes that sustain biodiversity and create diversity also have created those high areas of linguistic diversity. And so we find where biodiversity tends to increase, linguistic diversity also tends to increase. But the correlation, or the coincidence of linguistic diversity and biodiversity, comes to bear through the way we interact with and use ocean resources. So the maps you can now see on the screen illustrate how, or show you where, the largest number of fishing boats and fishers tend to be found. And again, most fishers tend to be concentrated around these coastal areas where the highest levels of biodiversity are found. They also tend to be concentrated across the tropics. So understanding how these cultural systems and ecosystems interact and interdepend with one another is critically important to one another. So many of us in the room will study biodiversity because of the importance of the functions it sustains. But biodiversity also has been found to support higher levels of biomass. So in fished areas, as you can see on the graph on the screen, we tend to have higher levels of biomass where we have higher levels of species diversity. So this is true in fished areas, but it's also true in unfished areas where we see higher levels of biodiversity, higher levels of biomass where we find higher levels of biodiversity. And we also find higher levels of productivity associated with biodiversity, as Cher showed about in her talk on Tuesday. So these high levels of biodiversity supports more productive fisheries. So that's one way in which these systems interact and interdepend on one another. If we think now about gear diversity, so move from what's in the water to trying to understand how people interact with what's in the water, how they shape what they catch. Coral reef fisheries are characterized by using a wide diversity of different gears. So if you travel to almost any coral reef community, you'll see different types of gears in use. And I first became interested in gear diversity working in Kenya, where it quickly became apparent to me that, yes, lots of different gears were used in lots of different communities, but the makeup or the composition of those gears differed. How many people used one gear differed from another gear in a different coastline, which suggested that there were differences in how diverse the gear use along the coastline was, allowing us to ask questions around what role does that diversity play in shaping outcomes for fisheries. So the graphs that you can see here, just show you two stretches of the Kenyan coastline along a roughly 12-year period. And you can see on the north coast, gear diversity, although there was a mix of gears in both regions, there's a low diversity in the north coast and a high diversity in the south coast. So we asked what effect did this differences in diversity have? And what we found, so in the graphs that you can see here, along the bottom, you can see gear diversity, and up the y-axis, you can see different measures of fisheries outputs. So we found that sites, and the dots you can see are different sites in different years. So sites with higher levels of gear diversity tend to have higher levels of catches per unit effort, so each fisher was taking home more catch. But they had lower levels of total overall catch, and lower levels of variability in the catch, and higher levels of mean trophic levels. So where there's greater diversity, fishers can expect to take more home of a higher value, and be more confident in what they're going to catch every day, whilst the overall pressure on the fishery is reduced. So gear diversity is likely to support a more sustainable fisheries. Now, these patterns emerge because when you have a greater diversity of gears, you're spreading your effort across a greater diversity of species and a diversity of habitats. So each is experiencing a lower level of overall pressure. So the graph or the ordination that you can see in the screen shows you how different gears, indicated here in different symbols, tend to target different species, which are associated with different life history characteristics. This is also found in how it spreads that effort across different functional groups in the fishery. So if we take a look and think now about dietary diversity. When I started working in fisheries, people didn't really talk about what people were eating or why. And as a result, I've spent the past 10 or so years trying to talk to fishery scientists and ecologists about why they should be thinking about fish as a source of nutrition rather than just a source of income or a source of biomass. Partly because this reframing would lead to lower amounts of fishing pressure overall. I've also spent a lot of time talking to food system scientists about why they should be thinking about fish as a critical source of the food system, partly because fish has critical dietary components, key micronutrients that are unique in fish products. I've always found it a little bit surprising that this argument has been really quite difficult to make. In part because the first evidence of seafood use and symbolic thinking comes from 165,000 years ago in South Africa. So that's almost 100,000 years before the first non-African descendants left the continent. So we, people, humans, have always evolved using and needing seafoods, and our bodies have developed to require key nutrients and key compositions of nutrients that are uniquely available in fish. I think people are beginning to catch on. Part of why fish are really important is because fish are really rich in things called micronutrients. These are things that our bodies need in tiny quantities, vitamins, minerals, and also omega-3. These are things we need, particularly for the first 1,000 days of life. But if we don't have sufficient quantities of these key nutrients, it limits our development, our physical and mental development, it impacts economies, and it impacts people's whole life histories. So we know that fish are unique because they have really high concentrations of these micronutrients. But we also know that these micronutrients tend to be lacking in diets across the tropics. These are diets that are otherwise predominantly plant-based. So these micronutrients, we can get them from other animal source foods, but many diets across the tropics have limited access to other animal source foods. So fish play a really critical and often thought of as irreplaceable role in these diets and in people's development. So fish should really hold the potential to close these nutrient gaps. Should also hold the potential to close these nutrient gaps because coastal communities, coastal cultures, and coastal diets, to coastal communities, cultures, and diets, fish has always been a central component of bringing people together, of nourishing families, and of sustaining households. But when I started working in fisheries, the information on how nutritious fish was really patchy. So we had bits of information on some species, often from global north countries in terms of their nutrient profiles. So we set out really to gather all the information that was out there in the peer-reviewed literature on the nutrient content of different species of fish. And we found information on around 400 different species of fish. But we regularly eat over 2,000 species of fish across the world. But those 400 species allowed us to develop predictive models to estimate the nutrient content of other fish species for which we didn't yet have the available data for, to allow us to answer a whole host of different questions. Now, these estimates are now available in FishBase and have recently been updated and increased the number of nutrients that are available there. And Jessica Zambrin-Mason has been leading work to extend these models, or to develop new models and extend the work to invertebrate fisheries, which will soon be available on Sea Life Base. These models have allowed us to ask questions at the intersection of ecology and nutrition that we weren't able to answer before. So we've been able to estimate and develop an understanding of how many nutrients are being pulled out of the world's waters through fishing already, and how that relates to what people need. And we're pulling out enough nutrients. We don't need more micronutrients. We have sufficient quantities, and most of the time in the places where we need them most. We were also able to establish that the areas where these micronutrients in fish catches are highest tends to be the areas of the tropics. We're able to contrast the amount of nutrients in tropical fish species to other animal source foods. So the bar graphs that you can see now show you at the top tropical fishes are comparable to other animal source foods. They're higher in some nutrients, particularly omega-3. But they play a critical, but clearly they play a critical role in people's diets. And we're also able to see how the vast number of fish species that we regularly catch, how nutritionally rich they are. So the bar graphs that you can see, or the frequency distribution that you can see here, gives you an indication of how nutritious, or the spread of how nutritious different species are. On average, roughly a 100-gram portion of fish provides sufficient nutrients to provide a child with 2/3 of their dietary, or 1/3, of their nutrient needs across 6 key micronutrients. But some fish, towards the left-hand side, you'd only need 40 grams. Other fish, towards the right-hand side, you'd need 120 grams to get that same nutritional impact. So these models have given the rise to a whole host of questions and a whole field at the intersection of fisheries and ecology. And a lot of this work is being led by James Robinson, Ava Mayer, Jessica Zambrin-Mason, amongst others, all of who now have their independent research groups, so do go out and follow their work. So we know that what's in the water is nutritious. It's diverse, but it's also nutritious. Joey Bernhardt has been able to show how that relates to what's in our diets. And what she's found, or what she's shown, is that when we consume a greater diversity of aquatic foods, when there's a greater amount of diversity in our diets, we tend to get greater nutritional benefits. So we need to eat less to get the same nutritional impact. So dietary diversity and a diversity of species in our diets supports more nutritious diets. It also supports more nutritious diets in another way, because when we eat a diversity of fish species, we pair that with a diversity of other foods. So we will eat snapper or rabbit fish with a different type of grain, a different type of greens, and together that will increase the overall dietary quality of our diets. Okay. So if we thought about what's in the waters, how we're catching it, what we're eating, all of that is enabled by the jobs that people do, the jobs that people engage with on the waters and at land. And often when we think about fisheries, we think about fishing. We often think about men. But there's a whole host of other jobs, other roles that are involved in coastal seascapes. From mending nets before or after people go out to sea, to processing fish once it's caught and selling it to distribute to communities either locally or further afield. This diversity This diversity in livelihoods is important in a number of ways. Livelihood diversity is hypothesized to reduce fishing pressure, as well as vulnerabilities to external shocks. And we know from the work of Josh Sinner that livelihood diversity provides flexibility, enabling people to respond and adapt to shocks. So livelihood diversity has the capacity at the community scale to support adaptive capacity. Livelihood diversity also, like similar to gear diversity, spreads out the jobs available and the roles involved in fisheries across a greater diversity, a greater number of people. And so it generates a large number of jobs. So this livelihood diversity gives rise to vast numbers of jobs and livelihoods across fisheries. This is particularly evident across the tropics, where we find that the largest number of jobs, in general, jobs for women and livelihoods supported, are found in Africa and Asia. So livelihood diversity in these contexts, by spreading roles out across communities, provides a really critical welfare function by supporting people's livelihoods, providing a source of income. And indeed, if we look at how across over 190 different countries, at the relationship between key aspects of key social characteristics and outcomes of fisheries, we find that when we have higher levels of linguistic diversity, so again, this is related to cultural diversity, more people tend to be involved in those fisheries. We also find where levels of formal education are lower, more people are employed in fisheries. They're more reliant on those fisheries, but those fisheries also support more nutritious diets, even though the production per person tends to be lower. So this linguistic diversity we see again tends to be associated with supporting livelihoods, whereas specialization, which happens where we move from a more diverse fishery to a more consolidated fishery, can undermine the welfare function undermining these livelihoods. And we see this most apparently when we contrast those livelihood benefits to the economic benefits that we get from fisheries. So the greatest economic benefit across fisheries, in contrast to where the welfare benefits are found, tend to be concentrated in high-income nations, so in Europe and North America. The catch per worker is highest, the exports per capita are highest. And if we look at the distribution of these benefits, they're vastly unequal. The Gini coefficient of catch per worker is 0.76, and export per capita is 0.9. This inequality in distribution is even greater than the inequality in wealth distribution. So undermining that tendency for specialization to erode the welfare function that coastal fisheries provide. So why then, given the vast benefits that diversity supports, the benefits of biodiversity, of gear diversity, of dietary diversity, and livelihood diversity, are we struggling to govern or manage for this diversity? Well, similar to these other aspects of diversity, when it comes to governance, we also have a diversity of governance approaches available to us. Customary systems of tenure have existed for centuries to determine who may use which resources, in what ways, for how long, and under what conditions, as well as how the rights and relations, the systems of knowledge, the responsibilities transfer over time. And these approaches have seen various success through time. But in the post-war period, and in response to a rapid growth in fishing pressure around the world, more modern approaches to fisheries management and governance emerged. And these arrived and often failed to acknowledge or recognize or interact with the existing systems of tenure. And as a result, we moved from these more devolved and distributed systems that involved diverse forms of knowledge to a much more centralized and consolidated approach to governance, with marine protected areas, with market-based measures, and with input and output controls. Now, these efforts have also seen great successes. If we manage fisheries effectively, if we have the resources to invest in managing, fisheries, whatever approach we use, tends to show or result in success. But the 1990s brought with it a realization that despite the success that these more top-down or centralized approaches had found, they had tended to erode levels of trust. Success tended to be concentrated where resources were available, and so efforts to rebuild and devolve fisheries governance down back to community levels to, in a sense, return to or re-recognize the previous existing systems of tenure emerged. And again, there are various examples of success that have emerged through these co-management relationships through time. But despite this vast choice of tools and approaches that we have available to us, we tend to emphasize, or we tend to have our favorite approaches. We either focus on customary tenure or top-down approaches, MPAs, input-output controls, market-based measures, or co-management arrangements, overlooking the benefits that the other systems provides, overlooking the context specificities of where things succeed and where they fail, and often, in doing so, in focusing on one area, undermining systems of governance that have succeeded, that do succeed, and that could do with being bolstered. So while a diversity of governance systems have developed to regulate this, we are not making the most of the diversity that it is available to us. And diverse approaches are necessary to fit the diversity of contexts that fisheries reflect. And divergent views are necessary now to bridge these ideas. So we need to recognize and respect the diverse ways of knowing, of governing our ocean. We need to give a more equal voice to those approaches, those systems of knowledge, as we heard on the first day with the first keynote, that tend to be overlooked or undermined. And we need to meaningfully recognize and respect and work together with those systems. Because just like when we come to study complex systems, we like to separate them to help us understand them. We also, when we come to manage, to govern, to shape our practices across these different domains, we like to simplify them. We like to, when it comes to gear, we like to specialize. We like to, fisheries, particularly if we think about fisheries in Europe, over time have consolidated, they've specialized, we've lost the gear diversity, we've increased the amount of catch individual vessels are getting, but we've increased the pressure on specific fisheries. When it comes to what we eat or what we choose to export, because it seems more efficient to focus on a limited number of species to get those more efficiently to markets, we shrink the number of species that are available for consumption. So in the UK, for example, even though we still do catch over 100 different species, we eat only 5. We export most of what we catch, and we import most of what we eat. So even if we were to try and reintroduce a diversity of species into our diets, we would have to reintroduce the knowledge around how those species are prepared, how they're cooked, how they're paired with, what they're paired with. And when it comes to systems of governance, if we focus on one system of governance, we'll undermine or erode the other systems that can be more effective in different contexts. So I hope I have conveyed an understanding that biodiversity is critically important because biodiversity supports more productive fisheries. So it's important to support functioning ecosystem processes, but it's also supportive because it can enhance and sustain our fisheries that many people around the world depend on. Gear diversity is also important because gear diversity can spread that pressure more evenly across a greater diversity of species and habitats, and so support a more sustainable fishery. Dietary diversity is critically important, and we're uncovering a whole host of different questions around how biodiversity relates to species and dietary diversity. But there's growing evidence that a diversity of species in our diets and a diversity of foods in our diets supports more nutritious outcomes. More nutritious outcomes at lower levels, more nutritious outcomes with, again, lower pressure on the ecosystems where those fish are coming from. Livelihood diversity, similarly, can support a greater number of people in a greater number of jobs. It may not maximize economic benefits, but it can distribute those benefits more evenly. It can sustain greater proportions of communities. It can keep people connected to and active and embedded within their environments and support more equitable fisheries and coastal systems. And polycentric systems of governance, where we can achieve a rebalancing of approaches, a rebalancing of knowledge systems, a rebalancing of priorities, can support more robust fisheries, because we can have governance systems that are better equipped to support the fisheries and the communities in the places where they exist. So the last thought I'd like to leave you with is an understanding that protecting biodiversity is critically important, and I don't think I need to argue that to anyone here, but it can't be separated from protecting the diversity of gears, diets, livelihoods, and governance systems that sustains it. Doing this really requires a rebalancing of whose knowledge counts, what systems of governance are recognized, whose voices are heard. And I think the sessions that we've heard through this week, the keynotes, all speak to the importance of these different dimensions and the importance of integrating knowledge systems across all of this. I'd just like to end with a few thanks. I think Julia said it wonderfully yesterday. The wonderful thing about science is it's so collaborative. I would not have been able to do any of what I do without the mentors who've supported me, the colleagues who I've learnt from, who've challenged me. There are many more people than are shown on this screen, some of whom are in this room, but thank you to all of them. And thank you very much to the organisers of this conference. That's all.
Thank you so much, Christina, for a wonderful talk. It's a gift. I think we have a couple of moments for questions if anyone has any, although I can't see anybody, so it'll be interesting to navigate. I can't see. Perhaps it's better to find Christina over morning tea and ask any questions that you might have at that point. So thank you again. Just one more round of applause for Christina, and then I have a couple of notices. All right, just before I send you off for morning tea, I've been asked to give a couple of extra notices today. A reminder, though we probably don't need it given the room, that the banquet's this evening, so I hope everybody's looking forward to that. And also, there are a couple of additional film showings today at lunchtime in room 516. So if you're interested in that, please head over and have a look at those. And for the rest, enjoy the almost last day of the conference. Thank you.